I never thought I'd come back to Maple Hollow. That little Vermont town nestled between the red maple hills was where I'd left behind my childhood, along with scars I didn't dare revisit and the name of a father who chose a different life, one that didn't include me. But on a crisp October morning, I got a call that pulled me back. "This is Dean and Associates. We're settling the estate of Harold Whitmore. You've been named in the will." I nearly laughed out loud. It had been 19 years since I'd last heard my father's name spoken to me with anything but bitterness. Harold Whitmore, owner of Whitmore Organics, a man whose name was etched into every barn door and grain silo in northern Vermont, hadn't spoken to me in nearly 2 decades. I was Anna Caldwell, the daughter no one talked about. Born out of a brief, hushed relationship with Helen Caldwell, the housekeeper who vanished under unexplained circumstances when I was only 8. After her disappearance, I bounced through the foster system and lost all contact with the Whitmore family. No letters, no birthday cards, just silence. And now, suddenly, I was being summoned, like some forgotten footnote in a chapter I didn't get to write. Maple Hollow hadn't changed much. Golden leaves clung to the last of the trees, and the air carried that unmistakable scent of harvest, sweet hay and cold stone. I drove past the old town hall, the grain market, the church with its crooked steeple. All of it was familiar and yet distant. The law office of Dean and Associates sat beside the old train station, a squat brick building from 1904 with frosted glass windows still etched with the Whitmore family crest. When I stepped inside, the room went quiet. 4 people were already seated. Of course, Eleanor Whitmore was among them, my half-sister, raised in the manor house, traveled the world, Harvard graduate, the face of the Whitmore brand, poised, polished, powerful. Eleanor gave me a brief glance and the barest nod. No smile, no words. Just enough acknowledgement to say, "I see you. I still don't care." "Thank you all for being here," said Mr. Dean, a slender man with silver hair and horn-rimmed glasses. He opened a large leather folder and cleared his throat. I sat in the farthest chair, hands folded in my coat pocket. I wasn't here for money. I wasn't even here for closure. I just needed to know if, in the end, my father ever thought of me at all. The will was read. It was everything I expected. Eleanor was left with the family estate, the organic farms, the 8,000-acre conservation easement, the lodge in Bar Harbor, the art collection, even the horses. I held my breath and waited for my name to vanish quietly like it always had. But then Mr. Dean paused. "There is one final item," he said, glancing at me over his glasses. "Mr. Whitmore left a handwritten letter to be opened only in Miss Caldwell's presence." Eleanor's brow twitched. "What letter?" "I haven't read it. I was instructed to deliver it by hand," Mr. Dean replied, producing a sealed envelope from a side compartment of his briefcase. The paper was thick and yellowed, sealed with red wax. My name was written across it in unmistakable handwriting. "To Anna, open when you're ready." The silence in the room was suffocating. I took the envelope with steady hands, though my pulse raced. I wasn't ready, not really. I didn't open it in that room. I nodded politely, rose from my chair, and walked out before anyone could speak again. I booked a room at the Maple Hollow Inn, a quiet, wood-paneled lodge at the edge of town. The room smelled like cedar and old quilts. I lit a candle on the windowsill and sat with the letter for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single folded page, lined and slightly crinkled, with words written in ink that had begun to fade. "My daughter. If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here, and if this is the only way I can speak to you, let it be a beginning, not an ending." The letter wasn't long, but each sentence felt like a weight dropping in my chest. He wrote of regrets, of silence, of watching my mother walk away and not stopping her. He admitted that ambition, pride, and fear had shaped his choices more than love or courage ever did. And then, at the end, a paragraph that changed everything. I didn't leave you the family legacy because I know what you need isn't land or money. I left you Cedar House, the home your mother once lived in. It holds the truth you deserve to know. The key is yours. The rest is waiting. I set the letter down and stared into the dark window. My reflection was faint, almost ghost-like against the night sky. I had spent years wondering why I was forgotten. Now I had something I never expected. A door left ajar, a whisper of a truth buried long ago. I didn't come back to Maple Hollow looking for redemption, but I might have found something even more powerful, a reason to stay. The road to Cedar House was narrower than I remembered. It twisted along the edge of the woods like a forgotten ribbon, barely paved, cracked from frost and time. Trees leaned in close, their branches scraping the windshield like fingers whispering, "Are you sure you want to come back?" I hadn't been here since I was 8. I remember the day we left like a painting that never faded, my mother's hand gripping mine, a single suitcase between us, and silence. Thick, heavy, terrified silence. That night we vanished, and a few weeks later she did too. Now I was returning alone. Cedar House sat at the end of the lane, tucked into a clearing just before the woods thickened again. It was smaller than I remembered, weather-beaten, with ivy climbing halfway up the stone chimney. The porch sagged slightly and the front steps creaked in protest as I climbed them. The key, the one left inside the envelope from my father's letter, slid easily into the lock. The door opened with a moan like it had been holding its breath all these years. Inside, dust floated in beams of morning light. The air smelled of cedar, dried herbs, and something else, something metallic and old, like rust and memory. I didn't know what I expected to find. Maybe boxes of papers, maybe a secret compartment, maybe nothing. What I didn't expect was that everything was still here. The same checkered curtains hung in the kitchen, the same iron kettle rested on the stove, and on the living room wall, faded but intact, was the photograph of my mother, Helen Caldwell, laughing beside a young girl in a red coat, me. I stood there for what felt like an hour, just staring. The sight of my mother's face broke something open in me. All those years of trying to forget, wasted. I stepped into what had been her bedroom. Drawers were closed, the bed neatly made. On the dresser sat an old wooden jewelry box, the kind with a tiny dancer inside. I wound it up without thinking. The music played, off-key but familiar. It stopped just before the final note. Inside the box was no jewelry, just a folded paper, brittle at the edges. I opened it slowly. If you're reading this, Anna, I hope it's you. If not, please forgive me. It was her handwriting, messy, slanted, just like I remembered from birthday cards that stopped coming. She wrote about fear, about watching her back every day after they left the Whitmore estate, about knowing someone was watching them and not being able to prove it. Then one line stopped me cold. Your Uncle Greg said he'd take care of everything, but Harold didn't trust him. Neither did I, and I was right. Uncle Greg? I had never heard that name before. My father never mentioned any Gregory. No one ever had. I read on. Cedar House isn't safe, not anymore, but I left something in the root cellar, beneath the second shelf, something I couldn't carry with me. If you ever come back, it's yours. I moved fast. The root cellar was at the back of the house behind a narrow wooden door half hidden by ivy. I tugged it open and climbed down into the cold earth. The smell was thick, mold, stone, and something like wet leaves. The second shelf was covered in jars of pickled vegetables and old mason jars filled with what looked like dried herbs. I pushed them aside, hands shaking, and there it was, a hollowed-out space in the wall covered by a false wooden panel. Inside was a metal box, rusted, locked. But taped to the lid was a key. My breath caught as I opened it. Inside were photographs, dozens. Some I recognized, my mother, me, even my father in younger days, but others were new. A man I didn't know standing beside a black SUV. My mother arguing with him in what looked like a grocery store parking lot. Notes in her handwriting, "Greg following again?" License plate BTR 1087. And then a small cassette tape. Old. Labeled in red ink. "Play this when you're ready." Back in the living room, I dug through drawers until I found an old tape player. It crackled to life after I replaced the batteries. I slid in the tape and pressed play. My mother's voice, software measured, frightened. "Anna, if you found this, I'm probably gone. I don't know what happened yet, but I felt it coming. They want something Harold hid, and they think I know where it is. I don't. I only know he was afraid of Greg. Said he wasn't just after money. Said he'd betray blood if it meant power." She paused. "I never stopped loving you. I never wanted to leave. But if something happens to me, find June. She worked for Harold back then. She knows more than she says. I couldn't trust anyone else." June. Another name I hadn't heard in years. She was our housekeeper before everything fell apart. Gentle, quiet, always reading. And now she was, a missing piece? I sat there long after the tape ended. Everything felt unreal, like I was watching someone else's story unfold. But this was mine, and it was starting to feel far more dangerous than I'd imagined. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I dug deeper. I went through cabinets, boxes, old drawers. In a locked chest beneath the stairs, I found more documents, handwritten notes, a property deed with my name typed on it, signed and notarized by Harold Whitmore 5 years ago. But it had never been filed. Why? Had he been planning to leave Cedar House to me all along? Did Eleanor know? I also found a map, roughly sketched but clear. It showed a section of land north of Cedar House, marked with an X and the letters V327C. A vault number? Next to the X was written, "Only Anna, she'll know what to do." By morning, I was a different person. I had come back expecting nothing. Closure, maybe. A whisper of apology. But what I'd found was a trail, buried under decades of silence, lies, and fear. My mother had been silenced. My father had tried to make things right too late. And someone, Gregory, had been watching the whole time. I needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them, June. The sun hadn't yet risen when I packed my bag and left Cedar House. The morning air stung my cheeks, cold and raw. Mist curled over the fields like smoke, and for a second, everything felt suspended, like the town itself was holding its breath. I didn't know exactly where to find June, but I remembered something from my childhood. She lived on the edge of town near the old quarry, a little blue cottage with wind chimes made from glass bottles. I remembered their sound, soft, eerie, beautiful, ringing out in the distance while I played in the backyard. That was 25 years ago. I wasn't even sure she'd still be there. But something told me she never left. Her house was still there, weathered, sun-bleached, but standing. The wind chimes hung just where I remembered, dancing quietly in the wind. I hesitated on the porch, then knocked. No answer. I knocked again. The door creaked open, not all the way, just a few inches. "June?" I called softly. A pause, then, "Who's asking?" The voice was old, hoarse, but still sharp. "My name is Anna Caldwell," I said. "I'm Harold's daughter. Helen's daughter." Silence again. Then the door opened fully. June stood before me, smaller than I remembered, but somehow stronger. Her silver hair was tied in a long braid, and her eyes, pale green, searched mine like a lantern sweeping through fog. "I thought this day might come," she said quietly. "Come in." The house smelled like tea, old books and lavender. Nothing had changed. Crocheted curtains, shelves stacked with cookbooks, a dusty piano in the corner. It felt like stepping into a time capsule. I sat at the kitchen table. She moved slowly, deliberately, placing a chipped mug of tea in front of me. "I found a letter from my mother," I began. "She said to find you, that you knew more than you ever said." "I do," June replied. "But I also know how dangerous it still is." "Dangerous?" June took a long sip of tea before answering. "What do you know so far?" I told her everything. The letter from Harold, the tape from my mother, the hidden photos, the strange label, V327C. June's face tightened when I mentioned that. "Vault 327C, she said quietly. "I didn't think he'd keep the number written down." "What is it?" She leaned back in her chair and stared out the window. "Your father was working on something. Off the books. A land trust. He was going to transfer part of the Whitmore estate into conservation, but not under his own name. He didn't trust the board, especially not Gregory." "Gregory Alden," I said. June nodded grimly. "He was Harold's business partner back in the early days, a friend at first, but Harold discovered that Greg had been siphoning funds, falsifying land reports, selling lots illegally. When Harold confronted him, Greg threatened legal action, and worse." My stomach turned. "What kind of worse?" "He implied he'd leak rumors about Helen, say she wasn't fit to raise you, that she'd been involved in fraud or worse. Back then, a woman with no money and no husband had no power. He knew it." "So that's why she disappeared?" "No," June said softly. "That's why she ran." She paused, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin, sealed envelope. She placed it in front of me. "I've had this for 24 years. Helen gave it to me the night before she left. She said, 'If you ever came looking, give this to you.'" My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a short note. "Anna, if you're reading this, you've already started down the path I feared. I don't know how far you'll go, or if you'll forgive me, but you have a right to the truth. Vault 327C is in the old train depot, hidden behind the records room. The key is in the locket I gave June. Be careful who you trust. Love, Mom." I looked up. June reached around her neck and undid a thin chain. Hanging from it was a silver locket, the one I remembered seeing when I was little, though I never knew it opened. Inside was a tiny brass key. "You'll need gloves," she said. "The depot's been abandoned for years. And be quick. Once people find out you're asking about Vault 327C, they'll want to know why." "Who's they?" I asked, already knowing the answer. June didn't respond, but the name lingered between us like smoke. Gregory. Later that afternoon, I stood in front of the old train depot on the outskirts of town. It had once been the heartbeat of Maple Hollow, a link to Boston, New York, the rest of the world. But when the rail line shut down, it had been locked and left to rot. I found a side door with a rusted lock. The key fit, though I had to push hard to make it turn. Inside was dark, thick with dust and silence. I used my phone's flashlight to navigate past broken benches, rusted signs, piles of forgotten crates. The records room was in the back, behind a sliding metal door. I pulled it open, slowly, revealing rows of filing cabinets and moldy papers. The air smelled of mildew and old wood. And then I saw it. One cabinet was pushed slightly away from the wall. Behind it, just visible under the beam of light, was a small steel door. Faded numbers painted above it. 327C. I stepped forward and reached for the locket key, but as I knelt, a noise echoed through the depot. Footsteps. Fast, heavy. Someone else was here. Part 4. What the vault knew. The footsteps grew louder. They weren't shuffling or cautious. They were fast, deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't just exploring the depot. They were looking for something, or someone. I backed into the shadows, crouching behind the file cabinets. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. Through a crack between drawers, I saw a tall figure enter the room. A man in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, worn jeans, hiking boots, flannel jacket. His face was partially hidden beneath a baseball cap, but when he turned to inspect the far wall, I caught a glimpse of him. I didn't recognize him, but something about his posture, rigid, watchful, told me he wasn't just passing through, he was searching. And worse, he knew exactly what he was looking for. He paced the perimeter of the room, flashlight sweeping across shelves. Then he stopped right in front of Vault 327C. My pulse froze. He bent down, examined the door, tested the handle. Locked. He swore under his breath, then stood up, pulled out his phone, and dialed. "Yeah," he said, "it's still locked. She hasn't opened it yet." A pause. Then, "No, I didn't see her. I'll circle back after dark." He hung up and turned to leave. I stayed perfectly still until I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore. Then I waited 2 full minutes before crawling out. I knelt in front of the vault. My fingers fumbled with the key from the locket, the brass slick with sweat. It clicked softly and the steel door creaked open. Inside was a metal cabinet with 4 drawers. I pulled out the top one. Folders. Dozens of them, each labeled in my father's handwriting. Land transfers, Whitmore Org. Gregory Alden, private agreements. Confidential, MH Holdings. Emergency clause, revised will. I stared at that last one. Revised will? I opened it. Inside was a notarized document dated 3 years ago, indicating a change in the distribution of the Whitmore estate. Unlike the original we'll read by Mr. Dean, this version split the estate between 2 daughters, Anna Caldwell and Eleanor Whitmore, equal shares, signed, witnessed, but never filed. I stood there, breathless. Why wasn't this version used? Did Mr. Dean know about it, or was he part of hiding it? The next drawer held a thick stack of surveillance photos, grainy images of my mother speaking to someone in a black SUV, the same man from the photographs I found at Cedar House. Each photo had a date and time written on the back. And one more thing, a typed memo, paper clipped to the last photo. Subject, G. Alden Meeting, W. E. Whitmore. Location, Edgewood Farm, June 12th. Financial exchange noted, estate manipulation suspected. It hit me like a cold slap. Eleanor, my sister, she wasn't just a passive heir, she was involved. I pulled out the final drawer. There, wrapped in a canvas cloth, was a handheld camcorder. Old but intact. I pressed the power button. Miraculously, it still worked. Inside was a tape labeled Truth, in case I'm gone. I pressed play. My father's face appeared on the screen. His hair was grayer, his eyes tired. The version of him I only knew from distant news articles and company press releases. But this wasn't the man in suits and speeches. This was a man speaking to his daughter, one he thought he'd never see again. Anna, if you're watching this, then either I've failed or I ran out of time. Either way, you deserve the truth. I was a coward. When your mother disappeared, I let people tell me what was convenient. But I never believed she left of her own will, and I never believed Greg was innocent. I tried to protect what I could. That's what the vault is. Not just money, not just papers, but truth and you. He paused, eyes watery. I changed the will. I gave you half. Not because I felt guilty, though I do, but because you earned it by surviving what we allowed to happen. Eleanor. She doesn't know everything, but she knew enough, and she chose Greg. Be careful. They'll want to stop you. But if you're watching this, that means you've already started. And I believe in you, Anna. You're more like your mother than you know. The video ended and I sat on the concrete floor, stunned. This was no longer about inheritance. This was about justice, about clearing my mother's name, about exposing the people who had buried the truth for decades, but I couldn't do it alone. I returned to June's cottage just after dark. She was waiting by the porch with 2 mugs of tea and a blanket over her knees. She didn't ask where I'd been, just gestured for me to sit. "I saw someone at the depot," I said. "He knew about the vault." June didn't flinch. "Then it's already begun." "I found the revised will. I found everything, Greg, Eleanor, even the camcorder." She looked at me, eyes sharp. "You need to take it to someone outside of Maple Hollow. No one here will touch it. Not the sheriff. Not the probate court. They're too deep in Whitmore's pocket." "I need a lawyer," I said. She nodded. "I know someone. Ruth Ederton. Used to represent your father before he consolidated everything under Greg's firm. She's retired now, but she still has fight in her." I pulled out the revised will and laid it on the table. June leaned forward to read it. A smile, small but proud, touched her lips. "Well, look at that," she whispered. "Harold finally grew a spine." But before the night could settle, my phone buzzed. A message. No number. "Stop digging, or next time it won't just be a warning." The message stayed on my screen, glaring back at me like a loaded threat. "Stop digging, or next time it won't just be a warning." No name, no number. Just 10 words that stripped the warmth from my skin and replaced it with cold resolve. I showed the message to June. She didn't gasp or panic. She just folded her hands on her lap and said calmly, "They're scared." "That means you're close." I wanted to believe her, but fear, real fear, had a way of making you second-guess every shadow, every creak in the floorboards, every parked car outside your window. By morning, I was on the road to Briar Ridge, a small town 30 miles north of Maple Hollow. That's where Ruth Ederton lived now, a retired probate attorney who once represented my father, long before he aligned himself with Greg Alden's firm. June had called ahead and Ruth agreed to see me. "She doesn't take many visitors these days," June warned. "But for you, she said she'd make an exception." The house sat at the end of a gravel road, tucked behind rows of sugar maples. It was modest, 1 story, with faded green shutters and flower pots that had long gone dry. But it was quiet, peaceful in a way that made you want to stay and forget the rest of the world. I knocked. The door opened almost instantly. "Anna Caldwell?" the woman asked, voice low but direct. "Yes," I said. "Come in." Ruth Ederton was in her 70s, maybe older, but still carried herself like a woman who once commanded courtrooms and made grown men squirm under cross-examination. She wore a navy cardigan and wire-rimmed glasses, and her silver hair was pulled into a low bun. Her living room was lined with old books, court documents, and framed news clippings. A fireplace crackled gently beside a cluttered coffee table. "I was sorry to hear about Harold," she said, pouring me coffee without asking if I wanted any. "We had our differences, but he wasn't a bad man, just a man too used to being advised by the wrong people." "People like Greg Alden?" Her eyes sharpened. "Exactly like Greg Alden." I handed her the revised will. She took her time with it, scanning each line carefully. Then she read the notes I'd found in Vault 327C, photos, typed memos, even the printouts of surveillance images. When she finally looked up, she leaned back with a long exhale. "You have enough here to open a formal probate dispute," she said, "and more than enough to bring criminal allegations. Fraud, will suppression, possibly conspiracy." "Will they listen?" She gave a dry laugh. "You're Harold Whitmore's daughter. That'll get their attention. But once they realize who you're accusing, Eleanor and Greg, they'll try to bury this fast. You need to move quickly." "Can you represent me?" "I'm retired, not dead," she replied. "If you want to fight this, I'll help you. But you need to understand something, Anna." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "Once you file your name, your mother's name, everything comes out. The media, the town, your sister's legal team. They won't fight fair. You're not just challenging a will. You're challenging the story this town has believed for over 2 decades. "I know," I said, "but I can't let them bury it again." Over the next 2 days, Ruth and I worked quietly, We made copies of every document, backed up files to encrypted drives, and prepared a legal petition to challenge the estate distribution under Vermont probate law. The revised will, valid, signed, witnessed, but unfiled, was our keystone. We also prepared a request for an injunction to freeze all Whitmore estate transactions until the court could review the new evidence. It was risky. Greg Alden had powerful connections. Eleanor had even more. But the truth had weight. And now, for the first time, it had a voice. The night before we filed, I stayed at a small inn in Briar Ridge. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching fog roll across the hills. My phone buzzed, another blocked number. I hesitated, then answered. No voice, just breathing. I was about to hang up when I heard it. Low, almost a whisper. You should have stayed forgotten, Anna. Click. I sat frozen, the line dead in my hand. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Ruth and I walked into the Briar County Courthouse. We filed the petition, the affidavit, and a request for emergency review. The clerk, a young woman with short curls and steady hands, accepted the documents and nodded once. It's filed. You'll be assigned a hearing date within 72 hours. And just like that, it was official. The Whitmore legacy was no longer sealed behind velvet curtains and smiling press photos. It was on public record. By the time I returned to Maple Hollow that evening, the storm had already begun. I walked into the general store to buy some groceries. The clerk, a woman I didn't know well, stiffened when she saw me. Didn't expect to see you back here, she muttered. I paid and left without another word. At the gas station, a man in a pickup truck rolled down his window. You better think twice before dragging this town through your drama. I returned to Cedar House after dark. It felt colder than usual. I locked the doors, pulled the curtains, slept with my coat on. Somewhere near midnight, I heard a car engine outside, not driving past, not idling, just stopping. I crept to the window, barely lifting the curtain. Headlights off, a dark vehicle. No one got out. It stayed there for 30 minutes, then disappeared into the trees. By morning, Ruth called. They know, the courthouse leaked. I already got 3 phone calls from reporters, and one from Greg's lawyer. What did they say? That you're fabricating the will, that Harold was mentally unfit, that the tape is doctored. I clenched my jaw. Typical. And, Ruth added, Eleanor's legal team filed a counter motion to strike the revised will. They're calling it a product of coercion. They're scared, I said, echoing June's words. That means we're close. That afternoon, I received a manila envelope under the front door of Cedar House. Inside was a single photograph. My mother in 1996, standing in a parking lot, encircled behind her in red ink. A blurry image of me, 9 years old, holding her hand, scrawled beneath it, she was never supposed to survive. The photo haunted me, not because of what it showed. I remembered that day. My mother holding my hand outside the old Fairgrove Market. We'd gone to buy canned soup and matches, planning a quick trip out of town that never happened. But what shook me was the message scrawled beneath it. She was never supposed to survive. They had been watching us, back then, now all this time. I held the photo tightly, feeling the weight of every lie I'd believed for years. That my mother had vanished without reason, that I'd been forgotten by accident, that Maple Hollow was just a quiet town with old secrets, not complicit ones. But now I understood. This place hadn't just buried the truth. It had helped dig the grave. Ruth called just after noon. They moved up the hearing, she said. Judge Wexler wants both parties in court tomorrow at 9 a.m. So soon? I think they're trying to push it through fast. Greg's team filed motions overnight. They're trying to disqualify the revised will on grounds of mental deterioration in Harold's final years. That's absurd, I said. He was sharp right until the end. The documents from Vault 327C prove that. Then we'll need to make sure they get in front of the judge. clean, clear, and undeniable. I'm ready. There was a pause on the line, and Eleanor requested mediation before court. I blinked. What? She wants to meet. Private setting, 1 hour, just the two of you. My first instinct was to say no. I didn't want her apologies or justifications. I didn't need her guilt. But a second voice, quieter, sharper, whispered, "Go. Look her in the eye. Let her know you're not afraid anymore." "Tell her I'll meet," I said, "but only at the old greenhouse, neutral ground." That afternoon, I returned to Whitmore Greenhouse, once the pride of my father's company. It had long since fallen out of use, glass panes cracked, wild vines reclaiming the space. But the sunlight still filtered in through the broken roof, warm and golden. Eleanor arrived exactly on time. She wore black slacks, a crisp gray coat, and an expression as unreadable as ever. She looked like someone who'd never been told no for very long. "I almost didn't come," she said, walking toward the old potting bench where I stood. "I almost didn't say yes," I replied. She folded her hands neatly in front of her. "I assume you know everything now." "I know enough." "Then let me ask you something, Anna. What exactly do you want?" It wasn't angry or sarcastic, just cold, measured. "I want the truth to matter," I said, "and I want what's mine, what was always mine." "You were gone," she said quietly. "You think I didn't ask about you? That I didn't wonder where you were?" I laughed, bitter and low. "No, Eleanor, I think you knew exactly where I was. You just didn't care." She looked away for a second. "Greg told me things about your mother, about how she manipulated Dad, how she tried to take you and ruin everything he built. Greg lied. I know that now." A beat passed between us. Too quiet. She looked older in the light, less polished, like some part of her armor had cracked. "I wasn't trying to erase you," she said. "I was trying to preserve the only family I had left." "You erased me anyway," I said. "But now I'm here, and this time I'm staying." She nodded slowly. "Then I won't stop you from going to court." "That's big of you," I said, not kindly, "but I'll warn you, they won't just come after me. They'll come after Mom, the town, your reputation. You're not just opening a vault, Anna. You're opening a wound." "I know," I said. "And you're ready for that?" I looked her dead in the eye. "I've been ready since the day I found Mom's name buried in your father's will." The next morning, I stood outside Maple Hollow Courthouse, holding my breath as the old wooden doors creaked open. A dozen reporters lined the sidewalk, cameras, microphones, people whispering my name as I passed. Ruth walked beside me, steady as stone. Inside, the courtroom was small, but packed. Locals filled the benches. Townspeople who had known the Whitmores for generations. Some I recognized. Some looked away when I met their eyes. Greg Alden sat at the opposing table, dressed in a dark suit, face like ice. His attorney whispered something in his ear, but he never looked at me. Eleanor sat further down, hands folded, eyes forward. Her expression was unreadable. Again, Judge Wexler entered, stern, white-haired, the kind of man who looked like he weighed truth on a scale of iron. The hearing began. Ruth moved with precision. She presented the revised will, the timeline, the video from my father, and most importantly, the contents of Vault 327C. She laid out the pattern of coercion, suppression, and manipulation. She showed records of property transfers, handwritten memos, financial irregularities tied to Greg and Eleanor. She introduced affidavits from June and the previous notary, and then she played the tape. My father's voice echoed through the courtroom, raw, regretful, resolute. She earned it by surviving what we allowed to happen. No one spoke when it ended, not even Greg. The hearing didn't resolve everything. The judge ruled the revised will would be taken under consideration, pending further authentication. But he issued a temporary injunction. freezing all estate transactions until a final ruling could be made. It was a beginning, not victory, but something close to justice. That evening, I walked alone to my mother's grave. I hadn't been here since I was a teenager. Her name was carved into a stone too small for the life she lived. Helen Caldwell, 1963 to 1996. Loved, missed, forgotten by none. I knelt beside the stone, laid a single maple leaf across it. "I'm not done," I whispered, "but I promise, I won't let them bury you again." Behind me, the wind shifted, and for the first time since I came back, I felt it. A quiet peace settling into my bones, not the end, but the turning point. The injunction gave us time, but not peace. In the days following the hearing, the town of Maple Hollow split in half. Some people whispered support when I passed them at the post office. Others stared like I was something feral, a creature that had crawled out of history and ruined their idea of what the Whitmore name had always stood for. I wasn't sure which was worse, the quiet sympathy or the silent blame. The local paper ran the story across the front page. Heir dispute shakes Whitmore legacy. I didn't read the article. I didn't need to. I was living it. 2 days later, I received a message from Ruth. "Emergency discovery. You'll want to see this." When I arrived at her office, she had a file open on her desk. She slid it toward me. "Found it in the county archive. Misfiled intentionally. Someone wanted it buried." It was a transcript, a deposition, dated 1997, Gregory Alden versus Helen Caldwell, child custody objection. I stared at the words, heart pounding. The case had never gone to court. It had been filed, then withdrawn, and handwritten in the margins were notes from Harold himself. Greg lied. She didn't abandon Anna. She was trying to protect her. Another paper followed. A restraining order Helen had attempted to file against Greg, citing threats and surveillance. It had been denied. Ruth looked at me, her face grim. "They didn't just turn their backs on your mother, Anna. They let her disappear, and made sure no one asked why." That night, I returned to Cedar House with those documents in hand. I lit a fire in the hearth, something I hadn't done since I got there. The warmth filled the room slowly, cracking the silence that had wrapped itself around the cabin since the day I arrived. I sat in the old rocking chair, my mother's, I was sure of it, and opened the last envelope I had yet to touch, a letter addressed to both Eleanor and me, my father's handwriting. To my daughters, "I was a man of many flaws, and I won't pretend otherwise. I let fear run my life longer than I let love. I failed you both in different ways, but the truth is, I loved you both. Anna, I wish I'd fought harder. I wish I'd chosen you when it mattered. Eleanor, I wish I'd taught you that love isn't inheritance. It's responsibility. What I leave behind is not land nor money, but a chance to choose differently. Don't waste it." I closed the letter and let the words settle into the floorboards. The next morning, I stood on the steps of the Whitmore Foundation building, staring up at its tall white columns. Eleanor had requested a meeting, not in court, not through lawyers, just us. I entered the conference room. It was cold, clinical, framed awards on the walls, a giant oil painting of my father looking out over a field of wheat. Eleanor sat at the long table, alone. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "I read the letters," she said, "all of them." I waited. "I didn't know how much he kept from me," she added, "and how much I let him." She reached into a folder and slid something across the table. It was a draft, signed, but not yet filed, a revised estate agreement, equal division. I looked at her. "This doesn't erase what you did." "I know." "This doesn't fix what Greg tried to do to my mother." "I know that too. He's under federal investigation. The vault contents are already in the hands of the DA. They'll handle him. And the town?" She gave a bitter smile. They'll find a new story to tell. That's what towns do. I nodded slowly. Why the change of heart? She hesitated, then said, because I finally realized what Dad meant. The Whitmore legacy isn't what we inherit. It's what we choose to pass on. We signed the papers that day. Equal heirs, equal burden, equal voice. I didn't feel victorious. I felt exhausted. But in that exhaustion, something else stirred. Peace. The kind of peace that comes not from winning, but from enduring. In the weeks that followed, I stayed in Maple Hollow. I repaired Cedar House, room by room, planted herbs where my mother used to, hung the photo of her and me in the living room, just above the fireplace. I didn't reclaim the estate. I donated half my share to a trust in her name, the Helen Caldwell Center, a small foundation offering legal support for women in vulnerable situations, like she once was. The rest I kept, not to hold power, but to build something of my own. The day I said goodbye to Ruth, she hugged me harder than I expected. You didn't just change a legacy, she said. You changed a story everyone had agreed to pretend was true. I left her house with the wind behind me and the mountains in view. On my final morning before leaving town for a while, I returned to the cemetery. I placed the final photo, the one of me and my mother, unblurred, unmarked, into a frame beside her grave. Then I whispered, "You were never supposed to disappear." But I came back. I found you. I told the truth. And now, they can't forget you again. I stood there a while, listening to the trees. No more footsteps behind me. No more letters left unopened. No more vaults left sealed. Just wind and silence and peace. In the end, Anna didn't just fight for land or legacy. She fought to bring light to the truths buried by time and silence. Her journey reminds us that inheritance isn't always about money, but about memory, justice, and the courage to speak when others stay quiet. If this story moved you, hold on to that feeling. Because sometimes healing doesn't come from what we gain, but from what we're brave enough to face. Thank you for watching. And remember, some legacies are worth rewriting. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe. And always remember, your voice matters. Your story counts. And this space was made for you.